and we do have quite a few serious topics to go through today. Okay, let me go back to what do we need to do. We need to address those 5 realistic assumptions for our scheduling environment. Aperiodic tasks, deadlines which are not on the cycle time, dependent tasks, and the last 2 are a little bit more lightweight, preemptive scheduling, and worst case execution times are not known. So, starting by tasks are not periodic, that means you have your aperiodic task, and in order to not mess with your hard real-time task, you just assign this aperiodic task the lowest priority. Okay? Does stuff. This is not satisfactory because usually aperiodic tasks have a fairly high level of urgency. So putting this on the lowest level is exactly the opposite of what you want. Now putting this on the highest level is kicking away all your real-time constraints which you have. So we have to control that. And there are 2 classical ways which I want to introduce how to solve that. The first one, we are introducing a server task on the highest priority level. This server task has a clear limit to its CPU time. And if I do have an application, so I can schedule that, can make sure that this actually works. But I only use that if I have a sporadic task which comes in there. This sporadic task has now immediately access to the CPU when it comes, but only for a limited amount of time. Then it's being kicked out. Okay, that's a simpler way of solving that. Server task. Called the deferrable server. If I do it like that, does it actually attribute the real characteristic of a sporadic task? Because I now schedule this sporadic task in a fixed cycle interval. Now my sporadic task does not really have a fixed cycle, right? How would you characterize a sporadic or aperiodic task? What is the parameter for your scheduler which you usually provide for an aperiodic task? It's not the periodicity. What is it? Nope. This is periodicity on average. But the more general term for a task like this is a different one. Would you accept a sporadic task which hammers at you every microsecond?
No.
No.
So should it be the minimum time between 2 occurrences?
Exactly. The minimum time between activations. The minimum inter-arrival time is usually the parameter which you have to guarantee for sporadic tasks. They can come any time, but if they triggered, there is a minimum pause before it comes again. This is something you can work with, you can reflect on. And you can implement your server so that it implements just that, not the periodicity which fits in somewhat in our real-time task, but we do it differently. We do it like that. Every time this task has been activated, we are replenishing the available CPU time for this sporadic task with a certain delay. So we used up this time slot here, and we are rescheduling this with exactly this minimum inter-arrival time delay. After that time, I'm willing to serve this sporadic task again, but only then. And now, if you see that there's nothing happening in the second instance, but there's coming a little at time unit 12, there's a new request coming in. It cannot really be fully served because it requests 3 time units. I'm only providing 2. And at the end of those 2, I have my minimum inter-arrival time, and say I replenish at time unit 20. That means I'm not scheduling anything if this task is not arriving. I'm just scheduling one time slot, which is available for this task whenever it arrives. And it cannot be rescheduled before a certain delay. No? Yeah?
At time 20,
Uh-huh.
have we, at like on point 20, we're using time, I think at the top, but we haven't allocated yet? Is that right?
Well, we're allocating it right on time 20. So from time 20 on, we have time available again for this sporadic task and can immediately use that one. It's now a bit of a definition of what is the minimum, how you define the minimum arrival time, whether replenishing time is part of that or not. Here it's not. Okay. It doesn't mean it fills all its deadlines, but it means that we are now serving the sporadic task instantaneously when it requests time, but we are not messing with the rest of our real-time systems. Right. Other strategies. There are two more possibilities which are classically used for sporadic events. One is dual priorities. That you have two bands of priorities where you say my sporadic task is running on the top priority until I'm becoming hard pushed for the rest of my tasks. So this looks like a static scheduling scheme, but in fact this is a dynamic scheduling scheme, because we have to watch out when we run our sporadic tasks that we change back to the normal order of priorities, where the sporadic task is falling at the lowest priority, right before we start endangering our major deadlines. So we have to keep track what are the deadlines at the moment, when do I latest have to change back to my normal fixed priority scheduling scheme to do that. Implementation-wise, this can be a bit easier, because you just have to flip priorities around in the process, not replenishing servers or something like that. Can I do the same trick with earliest deadline first? Quite simply, I introduce an earliest deadline first sporadic server. How does that work? Similar to fixed priority scheduling. So in both of these schemes, I can introduce a server task which I can utilize for just that. And similar to priority band swapping in fixed priority scheduling, there is a similar scheme for earliest deadline first. What does it mean for earliest deadline first if I invert the scheme? What is the inverse of earliest deadline first? Exactly, earliest deadline last. Hang on, earliest deadline last. Does that work? Does. Do earliest deadline last? Until you're running out of the sporadic server. Earliest deadline last does not mean you're violating the deadlines. You're just purposefully scheduling all of your tasks so that they just make the deadline. You order them now and the other way around. You're not trying to get to the earliest deadline as soon as possible. Just say, I'm scheduling them so that I still make all my deadlines, but I purposefully schedule them all to the wall. Optimizing for the worst characteristics of earliest deadline first by making it purposefully scheduled to the extreme. And while I have a sporadic server request, I just run earliest deadline last. In that case, prioritizing the sporadic server application. And when the sporadic server goes away, I change back to earliest deadline first as normal, which gives me a bit more redundancy in my system again. Okay? Cool. Those were the 5 major possibilities to schedule sporadic tasks. Are they supported? Yes, you get them in POSIX, you get them in ADA profiles. You have a whole variation of these sporadic servers available in your environments. And you have to be educated to choose the right one for your specific environment, or make a decision whether the one which is provided to you, usually not all of them are provided to you, is actually satisfactory for your purposes. So now it's getting a bit more interesting. Deadlines which are no longer identical with the period of my task. Okay, now I assume that first the more intuitive case. The more intuitive case is that the deadline is shorter than my cycle time. And the idea is that I'm now not ordering by rate, but I'm ordering by deadline. And we want to work towards what? What do we want to guarantee? Of course, I can't just order my stuff by deadlines. But what is the guarantee you want to have if you just order your stuff by deadlines? Okay, let's go back. What was the guarantee you got if you order your task set by period, by cycle times? What was the guarantee you had? Say again? If it wouldn't be schedulable, it wouldn't be working. Okay, refine a bit.
So if it's possible to schedule a bunch of things, then rate monotonic ordering would schedule it.
Okay, so if it's schedulable with a fixed priority scheduling scheme at all, then rate monotonic ordering is scheduling it too, successfully. That was the motivation why we have done rate monotonic ordering. That we knew that if that doesn't work, we don't have to look for anything else. Now what you want to have is now order by deadlines, which gives you, in terms of a real-time environment, a more responsive reaction of your system, because you now actually reflect your deadlines directly into priorities. So in a static sense, not in an earliest deadline first sense, but in a static sense, you are now giving priority to tasks with close deadlines. But you're only happy to do so if you at the same time guarantee that you're not losing things. Can you still uphold the guarantee that your system is still schedulable, even if I order by deadlines instead of by rate? Okay? So for that, we are setting up a lemma here. Any task set Q, which is schedulable by an FPS scheme W, let's assume there is some ordering of my priorities. If my task set is schedulable with this ordering scheme W, then it will also be schedulable by deadline monotonic priority ordering. You see where this is going. Huh? How do we prove that? In 3 easy steps. What do we need to do to prove that in 3 easy steps? For any 2 tasks which we find in this set W, that means 2 tasks where priority I is larger than priority J, but the deadline of I is larger than the deadline of j, that means they are not ordered deadline monotonic. For each of these two tasks, we will now generate a new scheduling scheme, W prime, by simply swapping these two priorities such that this combination of these two tasks will fulfill deadline monotonic priority ordering. So, and now we have to check carefully. This new scheduling scheme will also schedule Q in 3 different cases. If, first of all, for all the tasks which are outside of these two priorities, nothing is going to change. Are you agreed to that? Are you agreeable to that? So you have priorities here, priorities there. I have 2 priorities in the middle somewhere, and they were in the wrong order. I swapped these 2 around. Now the assumption is, if I swap 2 priorities in the middle of my priority bands, neither the lower priority tasks nor the higher priority tasks outside of these 2 will be affected in any way. Is that true? Good, thanks. So now the task J, has now a higher priority in W prime. And if task J was schedulable before, I can now walk you through that whole thing, but I think it's intuitively pretty clear. If you increment out of a working task, so at a single task, to a higher priority, this task is still working. I'm not doing any damage to a task by giving a higher priority. So the critical case is obviously the other one, because we demoted one task to a lower priority. And in order to understand what happens to the task with lower priority, I think we'd rather look at a little diagram instead of looking at equations here. So what do we have? This is the working scheduling scheme W with the 2 tasks Ti. The green thing is the Ti task, in case this is too small to see on that screen. It's just okay. And the red one is Tj. So at the moment Ti has a higher priority. And you see that the cycle time of Ti is larger than the cycle time of the other one. But the deadline is shorter. So we have to turn these 2 things around. What do we see in the previous scheduling scheme? Obviously, the deadline J is smaller than deadline I. Is that true? Sure. And the deadline I is shorter than the cycle time of I, because that was our assumption that all our deadlines are less or equal to the cycle time. And that consequently also means that the deadline for task J has to be shorter than the cycle time for task I. It's just quite simple, straightforward. So, a little bit more careful. If you look at the response times, those are the 2 response times to look at. Response time I, which is shorter than the response time of J. Response time I is shorter than J. Why? Because it has a higher priority. They will always have a shorter response time simply because it has a higher priority. That's already given. And this response time J, we are specifically interested in. The response time J has to be smaller than its deadline because we assume W is working. It is also shorter than the other deadline, which in turn is shorter than the cycle time of I. And that means something interesting, namely that Rj is shorter than the cycle time of I. That also means that task I interfered only once with task J. We need that. And the other way around, task J has only been released once inside its own response time Rj, and the response times are ordered at the moment. So, what happens if I move to swapping them around? On the right side, you now see that the task, the green task, task I, has been demoted, and task J is up one priority. So task J is harmless, but what happened to task I? We know that task J can only interfere once with task I, which means that the new response time of task I is coincidentally identical to the previous response time of task J. The new response time of task I has to be identical to the previous response time of task J. If you believe that, you're done, because the rest falls now into place. You're the believing kind? Get on with it. Don't know, I messed this up before, but I think that's about right at the moment. So, and then the rest falls into place because we know Rj is shorter than deadline J, that's shorter than deadline I, and that means that the new response time of I has to be shorter than its deadline. Yay! So the task which has been demoted but has a shorter deadline, has a larger deadline, will still work inside its own deadline. So we swap two tasks in order to bring the previous scheme into the realm of deadline monotonic ordering, and the swap does not affect schedulability. You can see the rest. Right? The rest is just recursion. If I can swap two, I can swap many more. So you're just swapping all the tasks which are currently violating deadline monotonic priority ordering. And with every swap, I did not violate schedulability, which means I can transfer any schedulable fixed time priority scheduling scheme into deadline monotonic priority, deadline monotonic ordered scheme, without violating schedulability. If it worked before, it will work here in deadline monotonic as well. And you have the side effect that now, as I said, you have your deadlines directly inspiring your priorities, which is usually closer to what you want or need in a real-time system. Cool. And that means, just for completeness sake, deadline monotonic ordering is optimal as rate monotonic as well. Okay? Bought into that? You now know two fixed priority ordering schemes which are guaranteed to be optimal. So, what happens if my deadline is larger than its cycle time? That's a bit more fun times. Now, do I release only after the previous one has been completed? That's commonly the case. So you have a regular release of my task, but if my task is running longer than its original cycle, it can still be okay because its deadline is actually longer. So occasionally it can run longer. And then you start the next iteration of this task only after this task has been completed. This is a task which you schedule fairly regularly, but occasionally it is fine if it runs longer. Obviously, if it always runs longer, you will eventually violate any kind of deadline you have, because then it's just pushing ahead and eventually it will violate regardless where you set your deadline. So it cannot run over every time. And that will lead to a slightly more complicated equation for the response time fixed point equation, which we need to analyze. And this has to be true for all releases of this cycle time. Maximum blocking time is the maximum out of all of these different release times. Okay. I leave that to you to stare at home at, to look at it a bit longer. There's no mystery around it. It's actually all quite straightforward to look into these calculations of worst case response times for tasks with deadline beyond their cycle times. Okay. So now I want to come to a very important chapter, namely the how do we schedule dependent tasks. Your tasks are dependent, otherwise you wouldn't be running them on the same machine usually anyway. So how does this reflect on your real-time scheduler? This is the task set independent tasks, how we had them so far. You can use deadline monotonic ordering or rate monotonic ordering, and that's going to work. Cool. Now, what happens if I have a shared lock, a shared resource? Graphically, I represent this shared resource as this yellow line here, and you see that the green task and the red task are both requesting access to this shared resource. So now it becomes nasty. Can you foresee what is going to happen? Let's run it. This is what happens. Green task gets into the CPU, is being suspended because the blue task has a higher priority. Right? Cool. Blue task completes, all fine. Green task is back into the CPU. Why? Yeah. The red task is not runnable. The red task requires a resource which is not available, so there's no point running the red task, it is blocked. Instead, the green task is runnable because it actually claimed this resource and is not going to surrender it. That means that we have now a situation where a lower priority task, in fact the lowest priority task, is delaying the highest priority task. This is called priority inversion. And you can guess, priority inversion is bad. Bad thing. How do we get around this? We invert the priorities again. And everything is the right side up again. How do we solve that? Ideas. So this is rubbish, and this is the most trivial class dependencies I could come up with. So it crashes immediately. It gives you really bad results. How do we resolve that? There has to be some sort of priority on the lock. What priority would you associate to that lock? Okay, let's start first by look at the progression here. The green task still has the lock, but the moment that the blue task comes back, the green task is suspended in favor of the blue task, while the red one, with an even higher priority, is standing in the wings and nervously looking at this whole thing, how all the lower priority tasks are playing around, even though the middle level task doesn't even use that resource. It doesn't play in that whole thing. It just wastes CPU cycles and not allowing the highest priority task to get into the game back.
So if you're holding a lock, you become the highest priority task.
If you're holding a lock, or alternatively, once the red task comes in, it presses some kind of the speed it up, guys. I'm standing here in the wings. I have the highest priority. And for the time being, because I'm the highest priority guy and I'm supposed to be scheduled now, I give you my highest priority. This is called priority inheritance. That the red task is handing over its own priority to the task it wants to have speeding up, the green task. That already gives us some incentive because now the blue task can no longer interfere. As we pumped up the lowest priority task to the highest priority, and it will now execute maximum speed until it can release its lock and get back to it. That's called priority inheritance, and this is in 3 simple sentences, just what I told you. Every time you're waiting for something which is currently blocked, you hand over your priority to this guy which is holding the lock, if you have a higher priority than the other one. So, what does that mean for maximum blocking for each task? Maximum blocking means how long you have to maximally wait until you can become scheduled. So now maximum blocking is referring to the lock which we have here. How long can you be blocked until you get access to the CPU? Yes. Yeah. And in case of priority inheritance, what can happen to you is that pretty much everybody else has currently stuff which you need. All the lower priority tasks can have acquired resources which you want and need to be executing. If that's the case, then you will be blocked for the sum of all the usages of lower priority tasks of your critical region of your specific resource. It's not too great, because that could be a fairly large blocking time. Yes, you accelerate and speed up all the lower priority tasks, but possibly one by one, because if they all are holding stuff which you want, then you accelerate the first one, completes, accelerate the second one, completes, etc. So this can be quite a large number. The one silver lining on the horizon here is that each task can only be blocked once for each employed resource. So if you don't employ so many resources, you cannot be blocked so much. If you only have one resource request, you know that this is only one maximum blocking time which you have to add to your blocking time here. Let's run this in practice. Okay. Now instead of the red task, the blue task is crashing. That was a situation without priority inheritance. That's with priority inheritance. I have this red rally stripe painted over the green task to make it go faster. And it goes faster by suppressing the blue task. But the price which I pay for that is that I just kill another task. Let's make it more interesting. What happens if I have not one lock, but a slightly more realistic case, I have 2 locks? And what happens now? Task dependencies with multiple locks. Now, you can foresee nothing too great. Okay. So now I have just 2 locks, and both of my higher priority tasks are both failing their deadlines. Okay. What happens if I apply priority inheritance to this scheme? What do I improve by using priority inheritance? The blue one is not applying priority inheritance because the blue one is actually using a different resource. And the blue one is actually schedulable directly. But by the time the red task comes into play, it wants to have something which the green task has currently under its belt and something which the blue task has under its belt. So it gives its priority now to the currently running task. What happens? The currently running task is the green task, right? So it gives its priority to the green task, and the net outcome is the green task feels better. Right? There's absolutely no difference. But the green task would have been running anyway. Now the green task feels much more proud about doing so and gets a red rally stripe, but still both of the tasks are failing the whole thing. Not great. Let's make it more fun. Circular dependencies. You had a bad programmer, and it actually you got a circular dependency into your logs. You see the circular dependency. You see the order in which the logs are acquired are actually reversed, so that you have straight away a beautiful deadlock situation. Circular dependency. How far is that system going to run before it deadlocks? Can you see that? Say again? For 3 time units, exactly. The moment that the blue task is requiring the yellow resource, you're running out of luck. Everybody's blocked. Everybody's missing their deadlines. Okay? Priority inheritance does nothing, because my system is deadlocked and I can accelerate people as much as I want. They're all locked. Okay. So how do I get out of this? Can I resolve this deadlock? Because you can say, why would I employ a programmer which programs circular dependencies? Fair. Yeah. Earliest deadline last. That sounds more like a patch that works in that specific case. But could you come up with something which solves that problem a little bit more foundation-wise, foundation style? Is there anything, obviously we're talking scheduling here. Is there anything the scheduler can do to not let it happen? What do you want the scheduler to do to not let it happen? Can you formulate this in a slightly more abstract rule for a scheduler? Don't let the green task run.
If the scheduler knows that the red task will require those 2 blocks in 3 or 4 or 5 CPU cycle later than the green task has been released, it can just prevent the green task from starting.
Okay, how about I propose the opposite of what you're doing? Only run the green task. What happens then? Possibly. Let's focus on a deadlock first. If I say, run the green task, nothing else, do I address, first of all, the deadlock problem? Deadlock solved, right? Cool. Can I formulate a more general rule around this than green tasks are good or green tasks are bad? What would be a rule which guarantees in that case, guarantees for me that you can never, ever have a deadlock? Can you define a scheduler which never deadlocks?
You tell it not to schedule in a task that's going to need a currently held resource.
Yeah, how do you formulate that? You don't want to schedule a task which is using what?
Already held blocks.
Uh-huh.
You need some sort of look ahead or some sort of resource free.
Look ahead, resource free. Sounds like a complicated scheduler, but yes. Look ahead, and what are you looking for?
Resource.
So will this task eventually need this resource? Mm-hmm.
What about you never kick a task out of the CPU that currently has any locks?
Yeah, that would be a bit radical, but it would be working. If you do that, that of course means that any task which has currently any lock can eliminate all the higher priority tasks. Even though, what do you do if the higher priority task does not need any locks? That probably sounds like a bad idea. But you're thinking in the right direction. So a task which has currently a lock, you want to keep in the CPU. If you do that, that means this task can acquire more resources, and everybody else was kicked out and suppressed anyway. So nobody else can hold the resources at the moment, because you say the moment the first task is acquiring any resource, it's sticking into the CPU. That means nobody else could have had a resource, because then the other task was sticking into the CPU. And that means the task which has currently the CPU will also be able to complete, because it can now also get all the other resources it needs, because none of the other resources have been given away. But the downside of your scheme is that now the higher priority tasks, which don't need any resources, are also suspended, and that's unnecessary. Now refine your scheme so that you still guarantee your deadlock freeness, but the higher priority tasks which are not requiring a lock are not affected.
We just have one global resource lock.
Ooh, global resource lock. And
So that if you acquire one resource, all the resources are locked.
okay. So whenever you okay, yeah. But how does this prevent? No, that would actually be working. Would it?
Prevents the circuit.
It sounds like the
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds suspiciously to a global interpreter lock of some sort, if you do that. Okay, let me throw another suggestion at you. That's called the immediate ceiling priority locking protocol, something that you actually hinted to earlier. Namely that you're looking ahead in a clever way. You're looking ahead at compile time by making your compiler analyze which task is touching which resource, potentially. It's not doing a runtime analysis in the sense of in which order is this task going to touch it and at what time, I don't care. But if there's a syntactical possibility that this task can acquire this lock, I include this task into my calculation here. Now I calculate the maximum priority of all of those tasks which are touching this lock, which are touching this resource. And I associate this maximum priority with this resource. Now you can see where this is going. Whenever I request this resource and I gain this resource, my priority will immediately, hence the name, will be immediately raised to the priority of this lock. What does that mean? It means that any higher priority task which doesn't come into that game is not affected. I'm only being raised to the highest priority of the tasks which are playing with this lock. If there's a higher priority task which is not playing with that one, I still have a higher priority in the system. I'm not overriding all the tasks which are not touching that. But I'm promoted to the highest priority of the tasks which are usually potentially using this resource. What is the guarantee which you can get out of that? When will you be scheduled as a task? When you are in the CPU, what do you know now about the resource situation? You're running. By the fact that you're running, what can you conclude?
You can acquire all the blocks you need.
All the resources which you could possibly touch are free at the moment. Right? Because if any of the locks which you could acquire are currently given away to somebody else, this somebody else would run with your priority. At least, if not with a higher priority than you, but at least with your priority. Which means you wouldn't be in a CPU. This is single core systems at the moment. We are talking in that context, by the way. Yeah?
Is that only true because you don't do a task switch with a task on the same priority?
Yes, fixed priority scheduling doesn't do task switching on the same
But
priority.
if
Yes.
a higher priority task comes in,
Yeah.
which task gets given back?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I don't have a ready answer why the scheduler is knowledgeable about this and not ordering them in the wrong way afterwards. I mean, it's simple to implement. I can, of course, come up immediately on the spot with methods to do that, but that's not expressed in those equations. That's an important point. And of course, that if you have to reschedule on the same priority, you're giving your CPU to the task which is currently holding any resources at all. And then your problem is solved. Okay. So that's doing that. What's happening? The green task is acquiring this lock. The moment it does that, it will be promoted to the highest priority because this lock is also touched by the highest priority task. And now the green task is becoming really stubborn, gets a really fast rally stripe, and races through all its resource requirements in one go. Okay, the blue task is now violating its deadline, because in order to resolve this deadlock, the blue task cannot be given access to the CPU, otherwise it would deadlock the system. Right? So we have a few deadline violations by reordering the schedule, but we actively remove the deadlock of our system purely by scheduling. Try to convince yourself that you can always do that on a single core system. There's also a disclaimer here. Multi-core version is a little bit more complicated. But on a single core system, you can already do that directly like that. Okay. Why don't you have this scheduler on your laptop? Your laptop can deadlock. I mean, you would never do that, but just theoretically assume your laptop can deadlock. If that's just solving it, why wouldn't you be using that scheduling scheme and be done with?
Some tasks will become more expensive. But the system, you want every task to be equally responsive. And it's really difficult to do that.
Yeah, you want to have this, yeah?
So, I don't think you're
Say again, I didn't quite follow.
There's still need to be able to compile time to look at everything that would be running on your computer to assign priorities.
Why would that be so hard? Why would that be practically even difficult? If all of your, it doesn't mean that, it only means that all of your compilers, your compilers need to have some understanding of the priority system of your operating system anyway. Right? So if you run the priority system on your laptop, and all of your compilers have some notion of priorities, why wouldn't they be all able to follow that scheme?
Then they should also agree on the same priority. They should still communicate with each other. So one compiler compiles a program that needs a resource, and another compiler compiles a program that also needs the same resource. Then they need to be able to know its priority to use.
Yeah, but from the perspective of your operating system, they're all just tasked on different priorities. So it means from one language, your tasks are not running at the moment because this other language required this priority level at the moment. So it's doable, but your point applies. This is not what you expect from a laptop. What you expect from a laptop is the illusion of everything happens at the same time. This is not doing that. This is running stubbornly the task through which has to complete its job at the moment. And this can take a long time. So you're violating the expectation of some kind of a round-robin time slicing scheme. Everybody is being kept in the air at all times. You have your Twitter notification and your Facebook pop-up window all running on a regular basis. This is not implementing that.
Also, a malicious task is just like variable one, never release it, and never stop the CPU forever, right?
Yeah. Yeah. True. So requires that those tasks which are being put in the highest priority task will also complete at some point. So you could prevent that. You can have, we'll have a similar scheme when we talk about cooperative scheduling. Even if you assume cooperative scheduling, you still usually have some kind of a watchdog which looks at your overall system. If a task has not been moving out of the CPU for a second or so, yeah, you just take the shotgun out and withdraw all resources and just kill this task blindly. You could still do something like that if you have worries that some task is then locking up your whole system by just endlessly keeping in the CPU. Okay. Cool. What does it mean? We already said the first one. Tasks will now only be dispatched if all employed resources are currently available for this task, which is giving you already the information you cannot have any deadlocks. And also the number of context switches are actually suppressed, is smaller. Could also be a good feature. What can you tell me about the maximum blocking time in immediate ceiling priority locking? What is the maximum delay which each higher priority task is facing? And amazingly, this is actually not as bad as it looked on the diagrams. Because in terms of immediate ceiling priority locking, how long will the red task need to wait?
Only as long as the longest subtask?
Yeah. It only has to wait for one task to complete its job. Because as opposed to priority inheritance, which is this trickling scheme through all the other tasks, giving the priorities to the other ones, I now know that this task already gained the highest priority, and I can only be suspended until this task is completing its job. If I'm runnable, I will be next. I know that after the green task, the red task will always be the next task. There's nothing in between. which is a guarantee which you have from the perspective of every higher priority task. Every higher priority task can now only be interfered with from one lower priority task. You're still so worried about putting this on a laptop? Doesn't sound so bad. You can only be interfered with once by one lower priority task. And you solved all your deadlock problems. You're still not buying? Okay. So, is that practically used anywhere? Yes. So that's available pretty much everywhere, and it's also the actually the default behavior in your Ada environment. Don't even have to switch any pragma anything on. This is the default behavior in your Ada environment. Does that mean Ada cannot deadlock? Ada is a deadlock-free language. So you can manage to program a deadlock in Ada? Think so? Can you? By deadlock, I mean deadlock.
So you can program a system that will sort of not terminate, like you have two.
No, that's not deadlock. Deadlock means you have a cyclic dependency. Of course, you can have a system which is just waiting for a printer which doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean,
that's not a deadlock.
One waits on the other, that one waits on that one.
That's a deadlock, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you have that in Ada? Well, okay, so I'm purposely misleading you here.
Does it depend on what the compiler is aware of the resource?
No, the compiler is available of these resources, as long as it's part of a protected object someplace. Otherwise, the compiler is not logging on them anyway. Okay. So I'm misleading you in a number of ways. First of all, you have more synchronization mechanisms than protected objects and shared resources, right? What are the other synchronization points you have in Ada? Synchronous message passing, right? So, no, a similar scheme does not exist for synchronous message passing. So if you use synchronous message passing in your systems, hey, welcome to deadlocks. You can deadlock your system by some simple combination of message passing. That's A. B, there is something slightly more complicated which is not addressed with that. And that is, you also have predicates which can lead themselves to a cyclic dependency, and that is your guard conditions. But as long as you don't have any guards, which as those predicates can be dependent on other things and can actually be leading to dependencies which are leading to deadlocks, if I don't have guards, I don't have message passing, yes, Ada is actually deadlock free. You cannot program a deadlock if you don't use any of those. There's no message passing in the Raven Scar, but you do have entry guards. Yeah, simple Boolean expressions can deadlock too. So I would say mostly, I have to be careful, but you can. There's still a window open for the single expression, single Boolean entry guards, which you have from protected objects, which can still deadlock your system.
Is that usually deadlock-free even in multiprocessing?
No. On multiprocessing system, the word looks a little bit different. Plus, there is another thing which makes your Ada system not deadlock free when you run on a desktop operating system, because on a desktop operating system, Ada can hop up and down as much as it wants. Those priorities will be ignored anyway.
Multiprocessor embedded systems.
They become common now, yeah. We're just at the brink of that. So having multi-core embedded systems is currently a bit of a high-performance thing. You have multi-core embedded systems these days commonly in routers, for example. That's a classical application where multi-core is used already. And in audio applications, in high-performance audio and video processing applications. That becomes more widespread. Everybody else is still cranking up the performance on single CPUs a bit more. And as you play with the Cortex A4 at the moment, this is becoming a quite universal standard as common performance, which is getting you pretty far already. I'm not quite sure whether I answer your question. So yes, it goes into that. And my gut feeling would be it will actually be expanding quite swiftly over the next few years, because cranking up clock rates beyond the current levels of some 70 megahertz, 100 megahertz-ish, people are very hesitant about, because beyond that point the energy consumption is increasing very rapidly. And energy consumption is usually not a good thing for embedded systems. So they want to keep this into this sub 1 watt category for most CPUs. And the trick is to actually have rather multiple of them, rather than crank up the clock rate, because then you will quickly shoot by factors beyond in the energy consumption. Okay. Cool. I think this is as far as we got today. We still have to cover preemptive scheduling and worst case execution times, but other than that we got through most of the critical scheduling things. And you have something to consider now about real-time system scheduling and deadlock freeness. How can you guarantee that? Have you been aware before that you can actually write schedulers which wipe away deadlocks? You have been aware of this before?
You went through the Banker's algorithm every time?
The Banker's algorithm is actually not preventing deadlocks. The Banker's algorithm is avoiding deadlocks. Right. So, yes, but this is not really by scheduler. This is much, much simpler and much, much more trivial to implement. You have a simple rule, compile time and analyzed. The Banker's algorithm is a really nasty algorithm at runtime, which takes tons of resources. And even then, it's not preventing things, it's just avoiding, if you're lucky, the deadlocks. And that's much, much simpler. Yeah? The Banker's algorithm is an algorithm which looks at your current system and analyzes whether A, it is deadlocked at the moment, because that's not a trivial thing to find. You can look at some graphics and see that it's deadlocked, or you can run some analytics. But you need to have an algorithmic way of detecting that your system is deadlocked. And the use case for the Banker's algorithm is to find out, will my system be deadlocked if I do that? So you can, anytime you're applying, you have a request for a new resource, you simulate to give this away, and then run your algorithm, which finds out, is my system deadlocked afterwards? If it would be, I'm not granting this request. I'm delaying this task, and rather run another task. That's the implication of Banker's algorithm. And if you use the information of which task can potentially request my resource in future, if you take this as the input to Banker's algorithm, then you can not only detect whether your system is deadlocked, you can also detect whether your system is safe, which means you can avoid deadlocks in the future. But it's a very resource-intensive analysis. You have to look through all resources, through all tasks, and have to trace the dependencies, and have to try to find a way out of them. Basically, what Banker's algorithm is doing, it simulates whether you can find any sequence in your scheduler which would allow you to complete all tasks. And this is done by exhaustive search. Would you want to do an exhaustive search through all resources and all tasks every time you require a resource? I think that's a bit easier, because that's compile time analysis. You don't run anything at runtime with respect to that, and you get deadlock freeness by design, not by avoidance. Okay. Fantastic. See you Friday, guys.